It was a warm afternoon at the city zoo, a place usually filled with the laughter of families, the chatter of excited children, and the occasional roar from the lion's enclosure. But on this day, an unusual tension hung in the air. Among the crowd, a young boy named Malik stood with his school group, his wide eyes filled with wonder as he watched the animals. Malik, a curious and spirited 10-year-old, had always been fascinated by wildlife. He dreamed of becoming a wildlife biologist one day, and trips to the zoo were like stepping into a piece of that future. But no one could have predicted how drastically his life would change in just a few moments. As the group moved from the elephant exhibit to the towering gates of the lion enclosure, the children pressed against the railing, eager to see the majestic creatures up close. The lions lay sprawled in the sun, their golden fur shimmering under the light. Tourists murmured in awe, snapping pictures. Among them was a young zookeeper named Ethan, a man who had worked at the zoo for years. Ethan was known for his quiet demeanor and an unusual fascination with the lions. But today, something about him seemed off. His normally calm presence carried a strange intensity, his eyes darting between the lions and the crowd. Then it happened, so quickly that no one could process it right away. Malik, who had been leaning slightly over the railing, suddenly found himself airborne. The world blurred as he was yanked backward and flung forward in one swift motion. Gasps and screams filled the air as Malik landed with a thud inside the lion's enclosure. Panic rippled through the crowd like a shockwave, parents clutching their children and voices yelling for help. Inside the enclosure, Malik scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. He froze as one of the lions lifted its head, the powerful creature's amber eyes locking onto his. The world seemed to stop as the boy and the lion stared at each other. The tension was palpable, every second dragging into an eternity. Meanwhile, chaos reigned outside the enclosure. Zookeepers shouted commands into walkie-talkies, visitors cried out in terror, and some captured the horrifying scene on their phones. Ethan stood rooted to the spot, his face pale, his hands trembling. It was as though he hadn't fully realized what he had done, or maybe he had. No one could understand why he, an experienced zookeeper, would do something so unthinkable. Some yelled at him, demanding answers. Others were too focused on the scene unfolding inside the enclosure to notice his haunted expression. But then something happened that no one could have anticipated. Instead of attacking Malik, the lion moved slowly, almost cautiously, toward him. The crowd fell silent, a collective breath held as the massive creature closed the distance. Malik, trembling but somehow calm, met the lion's gaze. And then the unimaginable occurred, something that would leave everyone questioning what they thought they knew about animals, instincts, and even humanity itself. What happened next would not only shock everyone present, but also spark a story that would ripple far beyond the zoo gates, raising questions about courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bond between man and beast. This is the story of that day, a tale of fear, bravery, and the extraordinary in the face of the impossible. The scene inside the lion enclosure was surreal. Malik's eyes were locked on the lion, his breath shallow and erratic. He couldn't move. Every instinct in his body screamed to run, but he knew better than to turn his back on a predator like that. His hands were slick with sweat, his heart thumping loudly in his chest, almost drowning out the noise from the outside. The lion's heavy paws padded slowly toward him, each step calculated, its powerful body a silent, moving force of nature. But the look in its eyes wasn't one of aggression. It was curious, almost gentle. For a moment, Malik wondered if he was dreaming. His head spun as he tried to make sense of what was happening. How had he gotten here? Why had Ethan, someone he had seen working with the animals every week, done something so reckless, so dangerous? Malik's mind raced, but the questions swirling around him weren't enough to overpower the immediate danger he faced. Outside the enclosure, the panic had reached a fever pitch. Zoo visitors pressed against the glass, their faces painted with terror. Some screamed for help, others pointed and shouted at the lion. Do something. Get him out of there. But there was nothing anyone could do. The zoo's emergency protocols kicked into action, but even the most experienced staff knew there was little chance of saving Malik without risking the boy's life further. The lions were unpredictable, and any attempt to intervene could provoke a violent reaction. Among the onlookers was Malik's mother, Layla. She had been standing near the entrance, chatting with another parent, when she saw the crowd's sudden shift in attention. She turned just in time to witness the moment Malik was thrown into the lion's den. Her blood ran cold. The horror and disbelief were overwhelming. She screamed his name, but her voice was drowned out by the chaos. Her legs trembled as she pushed her way through the crowd, her heart pounding with fear and desperation. She couldn't lose her son, not like this. Back in the enclosure, the lion had circled Malik once, its massive tail flicking through the air. Malik remained perfectly still, his eyes wide and filled with both terror and fascination. The lion sniffed the air around him, its breath hot and strong against his face. But then, the most unexpected thing happened. The lion stopped. It turned its massive head, its amber eyes narrowing as it fixed its gaze on something behind Malik. For a brief, terrifying second, Malik wondered if the lion was about to pounce. But instead, the animal sat down, its body low to the ground, as if waiting. At that moment, Malik's mind flashed back to the classroom lesson on animal behavior. His teacher had once told him that animals, especially predators, could often sense fear. The lesson had been meant to help students understand how to interact with pets, but now Malik realized how true it was. He forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to calm his racing pulse. He didn't know what to do, but he knew that staying still was his only chance. The air inside the enclosure seemed thick with tension. The lion stared at him for what felt like an eternity. Then it stood and slowly padded away, leaving Malik frozen in disbelief. Was the danger over? Or was this just the calm before the storm? Malik barely dared to move as he watched the lion take up a position on the far side of the enclosure. The other lions in the enclosure, 3 in total, remained completely still, observing Malik with watchful eyes. Outside, zoo personnel had already called in a rescue team, but it would take time for them to assemble the right equipment. For now, the situation was a delicate one. One wrong move could trigger the lions to act on their natural instincts. The zookeepers and security staff moved quickly, but it was clear that they were just as uncertain about how to handle the situation as Malik was. Then, there was Ethan. No one knew what to make of his behavior. After the initial shock of Malik's fall into the enclosure, Ethan had retreated to the edge of the crowd, his face a mask of fear and confusion. He was sweating, shaking, his hands pressed against his forehead as if trying to will himself into action. It was as if the world had gone quiet for him, and nothing made sense anymore. The crowd was beginning to turn on him. Questions flew from every direction. Why did you do it? What were you thinking? What's wrong with you? But Ethan couldn't respond. His eyes were locked on the enclosure, his mind too far away, lost in something only he seemed to understand. Behind the crowd, the sound of sirens grew louder, and Malik's mother, Layla, finally reached the scene. She didn't know what to expect, but the sight of her son standing there, unharmed, yet surrounded by lions, was something she would never be able to forget. Layla pushed through the barricade of onlookers, her heart in her throat, her hands trembling. She could hardly breathe, her eyes frantically searching for Malik in the chaos. Then she saw him. He was standing near the back of the enclosure, his body rigid, eyes locked on the lions. Layla's stomach lurched as she saw the lion watching her son, but there was something different in its gaze, something almost protective. Malik's heart was racing as he slowly turned his head to see his mother. She was standing by the railing, her face pale, her hands gripping the metal as though she could reach through it and pull him to safety. Malik wanted to shout to her, to tell her he was okay, but his voice wouldn't come. He was frozen in place, his mind trying to process everything that had happened. How had Ethan done this? Why had he thrown him in here? What was going on? It didn't make sense. Ethan had always been kind, helpful, someone who loved the animals, who had spent years working with them. But today, something about him had changed. Was it just a mistake, a lapse in judgment, or was there something more sinister at play? The more Malik thought about it, the more confused and frightened he became. But as the minutes passed, a new feeling crept into his chest, a feeling of dread that settled deep in his gut. Was the situation really as simple as an accident, or was there something darker behind it all? The tension continued to build. Malik felt the weight of the eyes around him, eyes of the lions, eyes of the people outside. His fate seemed to hang in the balance, and still nothing was resolved. Would the rescue team make it in time? Would the lions attack? Or would the unthinkable happen again? The minutes seemed to stretch endlessly. Malik remained as still as possible, his breath shallow, his eyes never leaving the lions. He could feel the weight of their gaze, the animals' presence pressing in on him. His heart was thundering in his chest, and the distant noise of sirens and panicked voices felt like a distant echo, as if he were trapped in a bubble. All he could focus on was the rhythmic sound of the lions' breathing, the occasional flick of their tails, and their unsettling calm. Outside the enclosure, the crowd was becoming more agitated. People shouted at the zookeepers, their voices a mix of fear and confusion. What is going on? Why aren't they doing anything? Layla, still at the edge of the crowd, clutched the railing with both hands. She could see her son, still alive, still standing, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Ethan's actions had been so abrupt, so violent, that she couldn't fathom why he would do something like this. It wasn't like him. Was it an accident? Or had something inside him snapped? Layla turned to one of the zoo security guards standing beside her. His face was grim, and his eyes darted back and forth between Malik and Ethan, who was still standing near the back of the crowd, his face pale, his body rigid. "Why did he do it?" she demanded, her voice shaky. "What's wrong with him? Why did he throw my son in there?" The guard didn't answer right away. He seemed as if he were trying to process the situation, to figure out what had happened, but there was a heaviness in his silence. Layla's eyes followed the guard's gaze, and for the first time, she noticed the strange tension in Ethan's posture. He wasn't looking at the lions. He wasn't looking at Malik. Instead, his eyes were trained on the ground, his fists clenched at his sides. His entire body seemed coiled, like a spring ready to snap. Layla's instincts screamed that something wasn't right, but there was more to this than an unfortunate mistake. Ethan's behavior had been erratic from the moment the incident occurred. After throwing Malik into the enclosure, he had retreated into himself, almost as though he were disconnected from reality. The experienced zookeeper, who had handled some of the most dangerous animals in the zoo, now stood as though paralyzed. His eyes darted around, unfocused, as though searching for something or someone. Was he guilty? Or was he trying to understand his own actions? Was it fear that held him back, or something deeper, something more troubling? Inside the enclosure, Malik was starting to feel a strange sensation, the growing presence of the lions. They were moving around him, silently watching, their every movement calculated. The largest lion, a towering male with a dark mane, had begun to approach him again, its steps measured and deliberate. Malik stood frozen, his legs stiff, his throat dry. He could hear the lion's heavy breathing now, almost as if it was sizing him up, trying to figure out what he was. Was this its natural curiosity, or was it something more menacing? The lion stopped just a few feet away from Malik and stared at him, its eyes intense, its golden fur glowing in the soft afternoon light. The tension inside the enclosure thickened as Malik felt a strange pull. He was no longer just an observer in this strange standoff. He was part of it. The lions weren't just watching him. They were waiting. For what? For a misstep? For an opportunity to strike? Malik couldn't tell, but the air around him seemed to hum with an unspoken warning. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him, the possibility of danger lurking just out of reach. Was he safe? Was he about to witness something he didn't fully understand? Meanwhile, outside, Layla's desperation was beginning to give way to anger. She could see the fear in the eyes of the other parents, the concerned looks exchanged between the staff. There was no action, no movement. The rescue team was still on its way, but the minutes were dragging by, and Malik was still trapped in the lion's den. Her mind raced with questions. What had Ethan been thinking? Why hadn't he acted sooner? The more she thought about it, the more she felt a sense of betrayal. This wasn't just an accident. Ethan had been a trusted figure in Malik's life, someone he admired, someone who had cared for the animals with a kind of reverence. To think that he would do this to her son, there had to be more to it. Layla turned to the security guard again, her voice shaking. "What's taking so long?" she demanded. "Why aren't they doing anything?" But the guard only shook his head, his expression grim. Layla's eyes darted to the other zookeepers nearby, all of whom seemed to be huddled in quiet discussion, their attention focused on the lion enclosure. They exchanged urgent whispers, but none of them seemed willing to speak openly in front of the crowd. It wasn't just Malik's safety at risk anymore. The entire zoo was on edge. Word of the incident had spread quickly, and the visitors, once excited and carefree, now stood frozen in place, unsure of what would happen next. Some had begun to pull out their phones, capturing the horror of the moment, but the images they were recording were hardly what anyone had imagined. What was supposed to be a routine trip to the zoo had turned into a nightmare. As the seconds ticked by, the atmosphere grew more and more tense. The lions, still watching Malik, seemed to be waiting for something. But what? The calmness they exhibited was unnerving, like they knew something no one else did. Malik began to wonder if they could somehow sense his fear, or if they were simply biding their time. Did they know that the humans outside were panicking, but the tension in the air was building to an unbearable point? The larger male lion, Malik had learned from his school field trip guides that his name was Rex, took a slow step forward. Malik could feel his heart racing, but he forced himself to stay still, remembering everything he had read about lions. They were predators, yes, but they were also intelligent, and in that moment, Malik wondered if the lion could tell he wasn't a threat. Or was it simply waiting for the right moment to strike? His eyes flicked back to Ethan, who was still standing off to the side, but now something seemed to have changed in his demeanor. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Ethan's body language had shifted. He wasn't shaking anymore. His fists were clenched, his jaw tight with something that looked like determination. Malik couldn't figure out what was going through his mind, but he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Whatever Ethan's reasons were, the truth was about to come to light, and it would change everything. But what that truth was, and how it would all unfold, remained a mystery that no one could yet answer. The air in the lion enclosure was thick with suspense. Malik could feel his pulse in his throat, his body frozen in place, barely daring to breathe. Rex, the dominant lion, was now only a few feet away, its golden eyes trained on Malik with a focus that made the boy's skin crawl. The other lions, once lunging lazily, were now alert, their eyes flicking between Malik and Rex as if in silent communication. Malik's mind raced. He couldn't think clearly. The minutes had felt like hours, and still no one had made a move to rescue him. He could see the zookeepers outside, huddled together, but no one was moving toward the enclosure. Was it because they were afraid? Did they not trust the situation? Were they waiting for the right moment, or had they just given up? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden shift in the air, a low growl that emanated from Rex's chest. The noise was so deep, so primal, that it seemed to vibrate through Malik's bones. Malik's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't even scream. The growl was a warning. The lion was testing him. He didn't know if Rex was merely playing, assessing him as a threat, or if it was about to act on its instincts. Every muscle in Malik's body screamed at him to run, to escape, but he knew deep down that he couldn't outrun a lion. He had to remain calm. He had to do something. Outside the enclosure, Layla was beside herself. Her body trembled as she watched her son, trapped in the heart of the lion's domain. Her mind was a blur of terror and helplessness. She had no idea what was going through Malik's head, but she knew one thing: he was in grave danger. The zookeepers were still huddled in whispers, their discussions frantic and unclear. Layla's eyes flicked back to Ethan, who was now moving slightly, his hands twitching as though fighting an inner battle. Was he going to help, or was he too lost in his own fear to do anything? The tension outside mirrored the one inside the enclosure. Layla's thoughts spiraled. If Ethan had caused this, why hadn't he acted to fix it? Why hadn't he jumped in, tried to help? Was this some sick joke? Was he too scared? No, there had to be more to it. Layla's instincts screamed that something darker was at play here. Her mind went back to the way Ethan had looked when Malik had fallen into the enclosure. He hadn't seemed panicked, but detached. Almost like he knew exactly what he was doing. The fear in her chest intensified as a sinking feeling took hold of her. Had Ethan planned this? Had he deliberately thrown her son into the lion's den? Back in the enclosure, Malik could feel the ground beneath him trembling slightly as Rex stepped closer, its massive body cutting through the air with a grace that betrayed its raw power. The lion sniffed the air around him, its breath hot against Malik's skin. Every nerve in Malik's body was on high alert. He wanted to run, to scream, but he remembered everything he had learned about staying calm around animals. He had to show Rex that he wasn't a threat, but could he even make it out of there alive? Rex took another step, now standing directly in front of Malik, its golden eyes burning with intensity. The lion's massive body loomed over him, casting a long shadow across the enclosure. For a moment, it seemed like time had stopped. Malik felt like he was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. His chest tightened with fear as he slowly lowered his body, trying to make himself as small as possible to avoid provoking the beast. Then, just as Malik's thoughts seemed to spiral out of control, a sound broke through the tension, a crackling from the walkie-talkie of a nearby zookeeper. It was a brief moment of clarity, but it was enough to break the spell of silence. The zookeepers outside were talking. They were planning. The rescue team was preparing to enter, but Malik knew it would take time. They couldn't just rush in. The lions were unpredictable. And what if it was too late by the time they got to him? Malik's gaze flicked over to the other lions, who had gathered a little distance away, their movements slower but equally cautious. Were they sizing him up? Were they considering whether he was prey? His mind screamed for action, for something to break the unbearable stillness. The lion's eyes followed his every movement, their stares like icy daggers that dug deep into his soul. Suddenly, Rex shifted again, and Malik's breath hitched in his throat. The lion raised its head slightly, its ears flicking back as it studied him. And then, with a fluid, almost graceful motion, Rex lowered its body, its front legs folding under it as it crouched closer to Malik, lowering its massive head to his level. For a terrifying moment, Malik thought that it might attack, perhaps now, perhaps after all this waiting. But then the unexpected happened. Rex stretched out a paw and gently, almost curiously, touched Malik's shoulder as if testing him. Malik froze, his body going stiff. The touch was like a jolt of electricity, but the lion didn't strike. It didn't swipe at him with its claws. It simply touched him. It was as if the lion were trying to understand him, to gauge whether he was a threat or not. Malik dared not move. He couldn't breathe. This was his moment, his one chance to survive, to stay still and show that he wasn't a danger. But what was happening? Why hadn't the lion attacked? Why wasn't it acting like a predator? As Malik struggled to comprehend the situation, the tension outside continued to rise. Layla's heart pounded in her chest as she finally turned to Ethan, who was still standing frozen near the edge of the crowd. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of 1,000 questions. "Why? Why did you do this?" she asked, her words shaky but full of an unspoken accusation. "What is going on? What have you done?" Ethan's eyes flickered toward her, but there was no answer. His expression was unreadable, distant. He didn't respond. Layla's frustration turned to fear as she looked back at her son. The zookeepers were still too far away to reach Malik. The rescue team wasn't here yet, and the lions, well, they were waiting, just like everyone else, for something to happen. What would it take for Malik to make it out alive? Would they get to him in time? Would Rex finally make the decision to attack? The tension in the air had never been thicker. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next move, waiting for someone to make the first step, for something to happen, for someone to break the silence. The outcome was hanging by a thread, and no one knew which way it would fall. Just as the tension reached its peak, a sudden noise shattered the stillness. A loud, almost deafening bang echoed through the air. The ground trembled beneath Malik's feet. For a split second, everything seemed to freeze, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Rex, the massive lion, whipped its head around in response, its golden eyes narrowing, muscles coiled, ready to react. The other lions, too, tensed, their bodies stiffening, their eyes darting toward the source of the sound. Malik's heart raced. Was this it? Was the noise a sign of an attack? But before he could process the thought, there was another bang, followed by shouts from outside the enclosure. It wasn't coming from the zoo staff. It was coming from the crowd. Layla's voice rang out, her tone filled with both fear and confusion. What's happening? What is that noise? The air was thick with panic. The visitors, already uneasy from the tense standoff inside the enclosure, were now in full chaos. Some were running toward the exits, trying to flee the zoo, while others, caught up in the hysteria, were shouting at the zookeepers to do something, anything. Layla looked around, her mind spinning. What was going on? Her instincts told her this wasn't just a simple rescue operation anymore. Something had changed. There was more at play here than just the lions or her son's peril. The zookeepers had been in a constant state of alert, but now they were scrambling. One of them, a tall man in his mid-30s with a broad, weathered face, looked urgently at his colleagues. His walkie-talkie crackled to life with frantic messages, but none of it made sense to Layla. It was as if there were a second crisis unfolding at the same time. Malik's eyes flicked nervously between the lions and the chaotic scene outside. But then something unexpected happened. Rex, the alpha lion, who had been so focused on him, suddenly turned its head, ears flat against its skull. The tension in the air shifted, but it wasn't fear. It was confusion. The lion was no longer the predator. It was now reacting to something else, a presence that none of the humans had noticed yet. In a flash, the ground shook again, but this time it was closer, right next to the enclosure. Layla's breath caught in her throat as she glanced back toward Ethan, who now stood rigid, his face pale. She was about to call out to him, but then she froze. Ethan's posture was different. It wasn't just the shock anymore. His eyes were wild, frantic, like a man possessed by something darker, deeper. His hands trembled, and for a moment, Layla thought she saw something flash in his gaze, a strange mixture of guilt and resolve. Then, everything exploded into chaos. A loud, rumbling roar, not from the lions, but from somewhere behind them, echoed through the zoo. It was a sound unlike anything anyone had ever heard before. The lions froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the noise. Malik felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was primal. It was feral, and it was coming from the shadows. Before anyone could react, something massive, a figure, perhaps twice the size of the lions, emerged from the trees at the far end of the zoo. Malik squinted, barely able to make out what it was in the dim light, but there was no mistaking the shape. It was another animal, but it wasn't anything that should have been in the zoo. This was something dangerous, something that didn't belong. The other lions, who had been so intent on Malik just moments before, now seemed to cower, retreating to the farthest corners of the enclosure. The large male lion, Rex, who had been so close to Malik, seemed unnerved, its golden eyes wide with something akin to fear. This was not the behavior of a creature at the top of the food chain. Malik's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced around frantically, trying to make sense of what was happening. The shadowy figure stepped forward, and Malik realized with a sickening jolt of fear what it was. Another lion, but much, much larger. Its fur was darker, its eyes gleaming with an unsettling intelligence. It moved with eerie precision, its muscles rippling under its fur as it stalked toward the lions that had once been the kings of this enclosure. But there was something different about this new lion. It wasn't just its size. Its demeanor was wild, unpredictable, untamed. It wasn't part of the zoo. It had to have escaped. Malik's breath caught in his throat as he watched the newcomer circle the smaller lions, pushing them back into the corners of the enclosure. The lions, once so confident, now looked like prey. What had they been so afraid of? Why was this giant lion attacking them, driving them away? Was it just dominance, or was there something deeper at play here? Outside the enclosure, the zookeepers were scrambling to control the situation. Layla's mind raced. What was this new lion doing here? Had it been brought in as part of some zoo expansion that no one knew about? Had it escaped from a nearby wildlife reserve? The mystery deepened, and worse, Layla felt a sickening realization crawl over her. Ethan wasn't the only one with secrets. Something far more dangerous was unfolding, and no one was prepared for what was coming next. Malik, who had been holding his breath the entire time, couldn't take it anymore. He took a step backward, instinctively moving away from the lions, but the newcomer, the larger lion, was getting closer. He could see its muscles tensing, its massive paws moving silently over the dirt, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he was afraid, terrified. As he backed away, his feet stumbled over a rock, and he fell to the ground. The impact made his heart skip, and for a split second, he thought it was over. He was too weak, too helpless, too far from safety. The new lion's eyes locked on him. Time slowed. This was it. This was the moment. And then everything seemed to crash into chaos again. But what would happen next was something Malik, or anyone, couldn't have anticipated. Malik's body was shaking as he scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The massive lion, the one that had emerged from the shadows, was now just a few feet away. His mind raced, trying to think of any way to escape, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. The overwhelming fear of being devoured by the beast surged through him, but at the same time, he felt something else, something colder, something darker. For a brief moment, the lion paused, its golden eyes locking onto Malik's, as though it was evaluating him. Then, with a sudden terrifying lunge, it moved toward him. Time seemed to slow, and Malik's life flashed before his eyes. This was it. He was going to die. There was no escape. But just as the lion's massive paws swiped the air inches from Malik's face, a blur of motion crossed his vision. A zookeeper, the man who had been frantically trying to organize a rescue from outside, leaped into the enclosure. He wasn't alone. Another zookeeper was with him, a tall woman with dark, determined eyes. The pair didn't hesitate. The man raised a tranquilizer gun and fired, the dart whizzing through the air and landing deep into the side of the rogue lion. The animal staggered, its movement slowing, but it was far from over. The woman, with nerves of steel, moved toward the lion while the man rushed to Malik's side, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him away from danger. The rogue lion let out an earth-shattering roar, but it was clear that tranquilizer was taking effect. The massive creature's eyes clouded with confusion as its muscles began to weaken. It dropped to the ground with a heavy thud, the fight draining from its body as it fell unconscious. Malik was shaking, barely able to stand. The zookeeper who had pulled him to safety held him up, his voice low and urgent. "Stay with me, kid. It's over. You're safe now." But Malik couldn't focus on his words. His mind was still reeling. Had that really just happened? Had he almost been killed by that monstrous lion? As Malik tried to regain his composure, his gaze drifted toward the other lions in the enclosure. They had started to retreat further into the corners, their fearful eyes watching the fallen rogue lion with a mix of wariness and respect. But there was no time to think about that now. Malik's mother, Layla, was rushing into the enclosure, her face pale with worry and disbelief. She was calling his name, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and anger. Malik. Oh my God, Malik. Layla's voice broke through the haze of his thoughts, and suddenly he was in her arms, his mother holding him tight, refusing to let go. He clung to her, trying to process everything that had just happened, his mind still trying to make sense of it all. But just as Malik was about to speak, to ask questions that burned inside him, he felt a strange sense of dread. He looked up, meeting Layla's gaze. Something about the way she was holding him, the way her eyes darted nervously between him and the zookeepers, made his stomach twist with unease. Ethan, still standing near the edge of the crowd, was staring at them both. There was something cold in his eyes, something that made Malik's heart freeze. The zookeepers had controlled the immediate threat, but now Malik felt like there was another storm brewing, a storm that had nothing to do with the rogue lion. Ethan's expression remained unreadable as Layla stepped back, holding Malik at arm's length, her gaze locking with Ethan's for a long, tense moment. There was something in the air, something unsaid between them. Malik could feel it. Suddenly, Layla turned sharply toward Ethan. "What did you know about this, Ethan?" she demanded, her voice low, but trembling with barely contained anger. The question hung in the air, thick with accusation. Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line, and he didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his hands shaking at his sides. His silence in itself was damning. Malik's chest tightened. Was his mother accusing Ethan of something worse than just negligence? Before Ethan could speak, another voice cut through the tension. It was one of the zookeepers, the woman who had been part of the rescue team. She was looking directly at Layla, her expression conflicted. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low and urgent. "There's something you should know." Layla turned to her, confusion clouding her face. "What is it?" she demanded. The zookeeper hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. This wasn't just a rogue lion. The one who attacked Malik. It's not from around here. It was brought in, quietly, by someone higher up. The zoo has been getting animals from other sources, secretive sources. And this lion, it wasn't meant to be here. Malik's blood ran cold. He had no idea what that meant, but the look on Layla's face said it all. "You're saying someone brought it here on purpose?" Layla's voice cracked, the realization settling like a stone in her chest. The zookeeper nodded, her eyes flickering toward Ethan. Layla's eyes followed her gaze, and in that moment, everything clicked. The pieces fell into place. Ethan hadn't just been silent in the chaos, he'd been part of it. He had known more than he was letting on. "I didn't." Ethan started, his voice weak, but Layla cut him off. No more lies, Ethan." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the thick tension. "How long have you known about this? How long have you been hiding this?" Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but the words died on his lips. Instead, his gaze dropped to the ground, and for the first time, Malik saw him crumble. The cold exterior, the detached look, it all melted away. Ethan's shoulders shook as if the weight of everything he had kept hidden was crushing down on him all at once. I didn't know how to stop it," Ethan admitted, his voice breaking. "I was trying to fix it. I thought if I could just protect you. Protect us." Layla's voice was louder now, filled with disbelief. "By putting my son in danger? You're telling me you brought a dangerous animal here and you thought you were protecting us?" The truth hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The rogue lion had been part of a much larger and more sinister plan, a plan that had nearly cost Malik his life. And now, with the walls closing in, it seemed that Ethan was no longer the man Layla had thought he was. But just as the truth of Ethan's involvement began to sink in, another unexpected noise, faint at first, began to echo from deep within the zoo. A sound that no one could ignore, and it was growing louder. The real question was no longer about Ethan, it was about what would come next. The sound grew louder, unmistakable now. It wasn't the roar of another rogue animal, but the heavy thud of something much larger approaching, something purposeful. Malik's breath hitched as the group turned toward the source of the noise. His mind raced. What else could be coming? The zoo had already dealt with a rogue lion, and now this. Layla pulled him closer, her grip tightening as her eyes scanned the surrounding area. "Everyone stay calm," one of the zookeepers barked, trying to regain control of the situation. "We need to get out of here, now." But it wasn't fear that had taken hold of the group, it was confusion. What could be causing this disturbance now? The large lion was unconscious, the immediate threat gone, but there was no time to relax. The air was thick with anticipation. As the rumbling sound grew closer, it became clear it wasn't just some animal on the loose, it was something far more dangerous. And then it appeared. A massive figure emerged from behind the trees, moving with a calm, steady stride. But this wasn't an animal, it was a person. And not just any person, a man in a dark uniform, his eyes cold and focused. Behind him, more figures emerged, all wearing the same uniforms. Layla's eyes widened in recognition. They weren't zoo employees. They weren't animal control either. They were something else. "They're here," she whispered under her breath, barely believing what she was seeing. The group was still reeling from the chaos, but the newcomers didn't hesitate. They moved quickly, securing the area, pushing bystanders out of the way, ushering them toward the exit. The zookeepers tried to protest, but the man in charge, the one who had stepped forward first, waved them off dismissively. "This is no longer your operation," he said, his voice low and authoritative. "We're handling it from here." Layla's mind whirled. "Who are you?" she demanded, stepping forward. Her protective instincts kicked in, her son's safety still at the forefront of her thoughts. But the man's eyes only flicked over her briefly, as if she were nothing more than an obstacle in the way of their mission. "I suggest you leave," he said, his tone final. "This is bigger than your son, bigger than all of you. You won't understand." But Layla wasn't having it. She stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "No, you'll tell me what's going on here. Now." The man studied her for a long moment, then gave a sharp nod. "Fine," he said, as if begrudgingly conceding. "You want answers? You'll get them. But this is your last warning. Stay out of our way. We're dealing with a biosecurity breach. We're the team sent in to clean up the mess. Those lions weren't just wild animals. They were part of an experiment." Layla's breath caught in her throat. "Experiment?" She glanced at Malik, who had gone pale, his mind lightly racing to make sense of the revelation. "Experiment?" Layla repeated, her voice tight. "What are you talking about? Are you saying they were tested on?" The man nodded. "Not just tested on, bred, genetically engineered. Those rogue lions, they were part of a larger operation designed to create a stronger, more dangerous breed. They were supposed to be used for certain high-risk military contracts. But something went wrong, very wrong." The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating. Layla felt a mix of disbelief and horror. This couldn't be real. How could something like this happen under their noses? The zoo, the animals, everything had been a front. The entire operation was a cover for something much darker, something more insidious. "They were using the zoo as a testing ground," the man continued, his voice growing colder. "We've been tracking this for months. These lions, along with others, are just the beginning. The real goal was never just to contain them. It was to perfect them, to create a breed of super predators." Malik stared at him, eyes wide, struggling to process the information. So those lions, they weren't supposed to be here at all. They were never supposed to be part of the zoo. "Correct," the man said. "They were introduced as part of a covert project, and things spiraled out of control when one of them got loose." Layla's hands shook as the pieces slowly fit together. Ethan had been hiding all of this. His silence, his reluctance to speak. He hadn't been just trying to protect them. He had been complicit. And now this. It was all part of a much larger conspiracy. Ethan stepped forward now, his face ghostly pale. "I didn't know, at first. I didn't know what they were doing." His voice was small, almost pleading. "But I tried to stop it. I didn't want Malik to be a part of this. That's why I kept him out of the lion's way. I didn't want him to know what was really going on. Layla's anger flared. You lied to me. You lied to all of us, she snapped, her voice trembling with fury. She took a step toward Ethan, but he stepped back, his eyes filled with regret. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Ethan whispered, but I couldn't stop it. The man in the uniform turned toward his team, issuing quick orders. We'll take it from here. Evacuate the premises. Get everyone out. Layla looked between Malik and Ethan, the truth finally settling in. There was nothing left to do now but leave. The zoo was no longer a sanctuary for the animals or the people. It was a battleground in a much larger war. As Malik held her hand tightly, Layla felt a strange sense of resolve. The truth had come crashing down, and they had survived. The rogue lion, the conspiracy, Ethan's involvement, none of it had been their fault. They had been caught in the crossfire of something far beyond their control. But the world wasn't going to let them forget. As they walked toward the exit, the last echoes of the chaos fading behind them, Layla couldn't help but feel the weight of what had happened. The zoo would never be the same again. The world would never be the same again. And as for Malik, the boy who had been thrown into the lion's den and had survived, he was changed forever. The lessons he had learned were hard and cruel, but they were necessary. The real story, Layla realized, had only just begun.